Our final panel today looks at generative AI, a technology that is all but certain to bring a step change to this industry on par with the internet's transformative effect. And with me today are 5 experts whose work has put them on the front lines of Gen AI, and they're about to help unpack some of its more complex and consequential elements for news, both good and bad. Let me introduce them to you now. Laura Ellis is the head of technology forecasting at the BBC, and I must thank her for making the longest journey, I believe, to today's conference, so very much appreciate that. Claire Leibowitz is the head of AI and media integrity at the Partnership on AI. Santiago Lyon is the head of advocacy and education at the Content Authenticity Initiative at Adobe. Amy Reinhardt is the senior product manager for AI strategy at the Associated Press. And Ray Thompson is the senior director of partners and alliances at Avid. Welcome to you all. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation. Everyone is so leaned into AI, generative AI, and so there's a lot for us to talk about. But I've introduced you all, but I want to start by going around and having each of you explain where your work is specifically intersecting AI so we can get a sense of your perspectives in context. And we'll go from right to left, so with Santiago to start.
Sure. So I head up advocacy and education for the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is a group of a community of over 2,000 media and technology companies and others working to set and implement an open standard around provenance, which is to say the origins of digital files, where they come from, how they might be manipulated along their journey from creation through editing and onto publication, and sharing some or all of that information with the viewer so that the viewer can have a better sense of what it is they're looking at. So you can think about it sort of like a digital nutrition label, in the same way that you might look at a food product in the supermarket and understand what's in it. Here you could look at a piece of content online and understand where it came from. And the intersection with generative AI is all about labeling AI and generative AI so that people can have those assurances as to where that file came from vis-a-vis quote-unquote real file. But we're also doing this work with hardware manufacturers, so it's already in production cameras out there, working with smartphone manufacturers, working with editing tools, working with publishers and CMS manufacturers. And the whole initiative, while it's underwritten by Adobe and is incorporated into Adobe products, the whole initiative is open sourced. And it's based on an open standard that was created by an organization that Adobe helped form called the C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which sits within the Linux Foundation and in essence is the blueprint upon which all of this provenance technology lies.
Laura?
Right, thank you. And we've been working together on this. So I have been at the BBC in this current role for 4 years, and we're always trying to make the point that the BBC is a technology organisation as well as a content organisation, and boy has generative AI helped that. So we've been using AI for years. We've made programmes using computer vision. So for example, one of our programmes, Spring Watch, which is a wonderful wildlife programme, has recently been using AI to go through hours and hours of footage and spot things that are happening, but not only things that are happening, but what is actually happening, what's the animal involved, what's the species, what's the individual animal. We've learned stuff about animal behaviour that a producer going through hours of content, you know, sort of scrubbing through would never have found. So some really great stuff, lots of language work, translation, transcription and personalisation. Then generative AI sort of like came onto the scene. We were talking about it in 2019 in our technology engagement space, which we call the Blue Room. And it looked quite interesting. And then as we all know, ChatGPT exploded onto the landscape, and it was like collectively standing on a roller skate, and we're still going. So we're now trying to work out how all these new capabilities mean that we can create new things, new products or parts of products for our audience, and how we can do that ethically and safely, because if we lose trust with our audiences, we lose everything. And as we all know, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, you know, generative AI has its moments and has its foibles. So just trying to create a cross-organization conversation about where we want to go with it, what we want to do with it, and how we do that safely has been absolutely exhausting and 100% brilliant. So yeah, let's hope we can sort of go into a bit more of that, but that's where we are.
Claire?
So hi, my name is Claire Leibowitz. I lead the AI and Media Integrity program at the Partnership on AI. And we are not a newsroom, but we are a partnership, per our name, of stakeholders from civil society, technology, media, and academia who work together to create governance for AI in society. And my background's actually in cognitive science and computer science, and I've been working in this kind of AI in society space for the past 10 years. And in that time span, we've seen what wasn't a term around generative AI come to fruition in the past year, but also many different stakeholders start to raise their hand in terms of their involvement in figuring out how we govern these systems in a way that upholds the truth and trust, themes we'll talk about today. And PAI's origin story, I think, speaks volumes to how we do our work and what we produce. We were founded by the heads of AI research in 2016 from the largest technology companies, so Facebook, Apple, Amazon, DeepMind, IBM, Microsoft, and Google, based on this recognition that the challenges in the AI field transcend any one institution. And I'm very heartened that the AP, Adobe, and the BBC are partners. Maybe one day we will work together more formally. But we do several things. We convene those institutions around big questions like what we posed 4.5 years ago of how we deal with an emergent threat at that time of AI-generated mis and disinformation, and also produce recommendations and guidance for the different actors who play a role in this AI ecosystem. So the guidance for an institution like Adobe that might be producing generative AI models or working with creators and how to do that in a responsible way might vary but be related to that for the Associated Press or even some of the technology platforms that might be distributing content. So we're really keen to think about how the entire pipeline of actors can play a role in governance of these systems and what technical interventions mean in terms of societal impact.
Amy?
Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Reinhardt. I work for the Associated Press for AI solutions at AP and for our members and customers. I was brought on to lead the local news AI initiative, which just finished up. It was a Knight Foundation grant funded project for 2 years. The idea was to get the landscape of AI readiness among local news leaders. We did that across all formats. We got someone to take our survey in every state, and we learned a ton from that. We built a 6-unit free online course that taught to those knowledge interests and deficits, and then we did a project pitch process, and we ended up just a month ago launching 5 projects, all of which are open sourced and able for people to use. You can find all information about that at ai.ap.org. AP's been a long time innovator in terms of experimenting with AI, going back to 2014 with our earnings reports, where we went from doing 300 earnings reports written by humans to 3,000 earnings reports. And there was actually a white paper that indicated that there was an uptick in the stock market around those released because there were 2,700 companies that had never been written about, and suddenly they had some visibility. So those continue to run today, and we'll keep experimenting around workflow efficiencies right now. I think is probably the safest area that people want to work in. I'm not interested in creating something that writes a story wholesale, and I don't want to put anybody out of work. So we're here to help those who are still in your newsroom. And about those 5 projects, 2 of them are specific to broadcast. So thank you.
Okay, right?
Hey everybody, I'm Ray Thompson, Senior Director for Partners and Alliances at Avid, and we're looking at AI really from 2 perspectives. One is, as I mentioned earlier today, Avid Ada, which is our overriding umbrella brand around all things AI. It's really a framework Avid is building to enable a variety of different services that will appear in all the different applications, so Pro Tools, audio, Media Composer, video editing and film editing, and then Media Central Cloud UX, which is all of our broadcast tool sets. And everything that sort of encompasses that, so production asset management, media asset management, and so on. And then I also have the luxury of looking at it from a third-party perspective because I talk to a variety of different companies who also offer add-on services that would leverage AI, cognitive services, semantic AI, and so on, to also offer a way to extend Avid's capabilities. So I have the fortunate opportunity to spend pretty much my entire day talking to multiple companies about them wanting to integrate into the Avid platform. And so, I get to look at it from multiple different angles. And as I mentioned earlier, Avid's been delivering AI services and features in the products for quite some time, but I would say that this year definitely feels different because of ChatGPT and OpenAI. Certainly, Avid and Microsoft have a very tight partnership, but a lot of the work that's been done has been done by Avid's R&D group, who have spent a significant amount of time this year, not only accelerating the efforts around AI, but also delivering some tech previews at IBC, co-pilots to help basically get staff up and running faster around using Avid applications, as well as things like being able to do transcripts, language translations, localization, and then certainly last but not least, being able to leverage it for things like being able to basically get language translations and then be able to do predictive sort of searching, right? So to be able to make recommendations, so a recommendation engine. So as you type a subject or a topic, it basically starts making recommendations, basically using semantic AI to basically make those recommendations for either A role or B role, right? So if you're talking about a specific team or political figure, it can go ahead and make recommendations about interviews you've already got in the library for that particular subject, and then it can make B-roll suggestions around maybe outside shots of a building or an event that will further augment your story creation. So it's gone quite a bit in terms of the amount of time, right? It's gone very, very quickly. So everything's accelerating, and that's really sort of what my role is within Avid and sort of what Avid is doing, historically and more recently around AI.
Okay, so I don't normally introduce panels this way, but I thought it was important for everyone to understand where people are intersecting this conversation for context. I want to cover a lot of ground, so I'm going to do so sort of swiftly, and I want to start with the positive upsides of using generative AI and the use cases for newsroom adoption, along with some of the problems that are associated with that. So I want to start with producers. They are some of the most overworked people in TV news. We've touched on this in a couple of earlier panels today. Ray, to start with you, how might Gen AI help lighten their load pragmatically?
Yeah, so I think the sort of shorter term things would include the creation of the transcript. That's definitely a big thing for efficiencies, right? To be able to not only see quickly a summary of an interview that you might have that's something you just shot or something that's historical that you just brought onto your library, and being able to see a short, long, or medium summary of that actual subject's interview, so you can quickly decide whether or not you want to use some or all of that interview at all in your piece. That's one way. The other way is then turning that into a transcript and then seeing exactly where in that piece those things are said, and then dropping markers that are permanent that can stay there, that you can easily navigate to. So when you do those searches, those markers stay there, right? So what's great about it is because it's semantic, the transcripts and the translation or summary is not permanent. It basically is something that just comes up, and again, because it's semantic AI, and it happens within a second. And then at the same time, you can permanently sort of mark the clip with the necessary data for you to be able to search on it. And then a recent thing that we've added is the ability to mix searches, right? So up until recent versions of Media Central, you could only search on either metadata or do phonetic searches. Now you can mix and match all of that in the same search. So we're driving efficiencies, right? We're trying to take some of these mundane tasks that in the past were not only basically very manually intensive, but also prone to error because oftentimes it's a person doing it, and they're doing it for hours and hours on end, and they might make mistakes, right? So this eliminates a lot of that, and semantic is extremely accurate because it's using language models and sort of the way in which it sort of leverages, a variety of different techniques to sort of bridge the gap between what we used to know and sort of what we're doing today. So really, it's driving efficiencies. It's basically making things go faster, and hopefully allowing you to do what you did, which with your stock reports, which is deliver more content and deliver it at scale and do so much faster.
And I know AP is doing some also the kind of natural language, the searching of its archives have kind of tapped into some of that same.
Yep, we've added a search tool called Merlin, and so the idea is, it used to be you could only search by meta tags. So if you wanted to search for Joe Biden eating an ice cream cone, it had to have been tagged ice cream cone, but probably the person entering it wouldn't think to add it to, ice cream cone to it. Now you can find it. He likes ice cream. That's why I bring that up. And you can search for it now on AP, but that didn't used to come up.
Right.
And so now we're
very, very, very granular.
That's for video and photos.
Laura, among the things you have been looking at are the leveling up opportunities that generative AI affords. What are some of those applications?
The thing that really took me by surprise right in the early days was we're using it pretty informally. So we're not using it on work emails at the moment because we're concerned about the safety of it. But, you know, inevitably in an experimental organization and a creative one, you'll have people trying stuff out. And people were still coming to us and saying, do you know, I wrote an email the other day and I'm not very good at writing emails very formally. So I asked ChatGPT to write it for me and it was much better and it saved me some time. And I have a dyslexic member of staff who said it's totally changed my life. It means that I don't have to kind of struggle and worry that everything I write, you know, isn't going to work for me. And I thought that's very interesting. What is the kind of the application for that, you know, more widely in the newsroom? And talking to some of the producers that we work with, they were saying things like, this gives me time, because if I'm researching a subject I know nothing about, I can ask ChatGPT, and I'm just going to use ChatGPT generically, because obviously other systems exist. And it will give me some lines of inquiry. And I think, again, that's quite a good use case because you're not cutting the human out of the loop. You're making sure that somebody's checking, but it just gives somebody who doesn't know anything about, say, you know, blood diamonds, just some kind of avenues to pursue. And then, as you're saying, summarizing, you know, big chunks of text, big documents, which might otherwise be quite difficult to work your way through. So it's these kind of like little gains. Everyone's using it for headline generation, aren't they? They're practicing and seeing, because headlines, if you've written pieces of news, they're the most difficult thing to think of, aren't they? They're really tricky, and you sit there for ages going, what's the headline? This will give you 10 versions, and you pick one. So I think those kind of marginal gains are kind of going to be where it's at for a little while. I think, again, just audience-facing stuff is a bit more complicated, and we need to be absolutely sure that we're not. Everyone uses this word human in the loop. I don't think it's the right way to describe it. I think we're putting the machine into the loop, and the human is remaining very much in charge of what we're doing with our output. But it is fascinating to see this start to make an impact, to save people time, to level up, to give people the opportunity to maybe do more creative things and to spend their time more productively. So that's where we are at the moment.
And sticking just with the unmitigated net positive right now, Amy, I understand that in terms of the sifting and triaging, the deluge of information that we all get every day in our inboxes, I understand that you've been looking at how AI can create hierarchies of newsworthiness for stories, potentially?
That was one of our the 5 projects. It was pitched to us for a newsroom in Alaska who said, I'm having a really hard time recruiting people, especially when they find out they're the ones who are tasked with dealing with the inbox, the general news inbox, which I'm sure all of your newsrooms have. And so we weren't able to close that because a lot of broadcasters, as you probably know, don't use open source technologies or won't allow open source into their newsroom. So we found a local newsroom in Pennsylvania, WFMZ, to take this project on. And what they did was they assigned 5,000 emails, newsworthy, not newsworthy, maybe. And so each one of those 5,000 emails then went, the maybe bucket was reviewed by a human, and then the yes bucket gets populated into the, in this case, the ENPS planning calendar. And what's really cool about it is, sometimes on press releases, there's like 6 different dates and times. It knows, it has been trained to identify the right date and time of the event. So it populates it into the calendar. It was our most ambitious project. It has data science into it. And so anybody using the open source version will get a stripped down version of that and will have to train it on their own. We partnered with university development teams to create these projects. It kept our costs low, optimism and new ideas high, and one person has landed a job in a newsroom as a developer, which is what we wanted to create. We wanted to create a pipeline of comp sci people who are interested in earning low wages but doing something really great.
Okay. And now also versioning. Yeah. Versioning is extreme. Anybody can take this, but how? I mean, I've already spoken to TV newsrooms that are using it to version. That's enormously time-consuming for them. So, what are the best case applications that we're seeing there now, for anybody? Nobody? Okay. Well, we are.
Newsrooms are very cautious right now from using anything. I think Laura was right to say about the public facing. Like we feel comfortable in the non-public facing and the workflow efficiency stuff. It's the public facing that is a problem, and I think it would be great to be able to have a large language model that's trained on broadcast scripts, for example, so that if you have a 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 10 o'clock script, that first one gets written by a human, and the other ones get iterated maybe by a chat GPT that would spare your broadcaster they would be less bored maybe, your audience would have something new. I mean, those are one thing that is a potential for this, I think.
That sort of brings us into the tricky territory. So let's start to go, I mean, there is a distinction, and it's a very hard line to draw between assistive and authorial in this application. And so where do we even start to draw that line?
That's general. I'll chime in and say, so the reason an institution like ours got involved, not as a newsroom, in this question of how do we deploy AI technologies in a news context and think about the impact of AI on news more broadly, was to look at this trade-off question. And there are all these potential cost savings and time savings things that come with everything being described here. And at the same time, there may be unintended consequences of deploying these systems without that kind of human component oversight that is going to make sure that you don't have a misstep. So we've been kind of producing a series of guidance that might enable you as, you know, a newsroom leader to ask yourself this question of, if we are going to implement that broadcast technology that automatically transcribes my 4 p.m. broadcast script to the 10 p.m., 8 p.m., and whatever other fusion of times you're producing for, what are the impacts of this? What do the people in the newsroom think about implementing that technology? Do they like it? That's a question. Workplace integration. Of course, you can say just tell your staff to implement it, but do people want to use that system? You might also ask, what types of errors might it make? Will it start telling a story in a really derogatory way? You wouldn't want that to be on your broadcast. This may sound really simplistic, and it's not kind of an academic exercise that you want your staff to sit down and work through, but basically we put out this, you know, news AI in the newsroom deployment guidebook with guidance from a lot of the people on this team that are this stage that asks those questions of newsrooms. And we have a hand raised. I don't know if you're taking.
But I also, too, I'm not blind to the fact that it brings up huge union implications. Huge. Yeah.
All right, Mike, go ahead.
So it occurs to me that there's a danger for homogenization here. If everybody is using the same model, let's say it's an AP model, then everybody begins to sound like the AP. And for the AP, that's good, but that's not necessarily good for individual organizations. And I wonder if you can speak to the importance of news organizations building their own prompts and context so that whenever these things do generate the 10 p.m. version from the 5 p.m. version, it sounds like it came from them and not from somebody else.
Yeah, I think it would be ideal, in an ideal world, my dream world, AP would be a base model and newsrooms would fine tune on top of it. So your newsrooms, and if you're Sinclair, for example, and you have a couple dozen newsrooms, you would train it on each newsroom, and then it would sound more individual.
You bring up an interesting point, though, which there are different technical and human level methods for making something bespoke. So one is fine tuning, which is more at the kind of model development layer that you can actually figure out what's in the input and how it responds. Another, which you brought up, is what prompts do you say? So if you're interfacing with a model and say, you know, give me a article in the style of Cosmo Girl and ChatGPT, even the AP might know how to wrestle with that type of language. And I know you are not working for Cosmo Girl. I think that magazine is defunct now, but you get my point in terms of trying to hyper-tailor things. So this is an interesting example of how do we take this social concept, which is we want bespoke, you know, deployment of these systems, and then at a technical level, who's responsible for making that happen? It could be the model provider. It could also be you and asking some of the questions for how you tailor everything.
So years ago, I worked for a company that brought in a bunch of Ivy League MBAs to write reports. Okay.
Are they bad?
And they were horrible because the people they brought in had no context, but they sounded really, really good. And I just realized this is what AI sometimes sounds like, because it begins to hallucinate. They're writing good reports, but without the context on that. I'm beginning to think that AI in the newsroom is like one of these MBAs you're bringing in. Really powerful, but without context. But to make them valuable in your organization, you need to provide them the prompt and the training.
Santiago?
Yeah, so in a previous life, I spent 25 years at the AP in a variety of functions. And I was there when we started the earnings reports, the automated earnings reports. And I think there's a useful distinction to be made here between what you might refer to as clerical journalism, which is essentially taking data and transcribing it, if you like, into a vernacular that is not a spreadsheet. And the obvious application there was the earnings reports. And to an earlier point that was made about what the reaction was in the newsroom, initially the reaction was pretty bad because people thought that these AI earnings reports were going to, take away jobs. What ultimately ended up happening was that it freed up the business journalists to do more in-depth, investigative, reportorial stories that are arguably more valuable. And I can see applications for that sort of transcription of data into stories in other areas where data is really important, like sports, for example. You're getting a huge amount of data generated from statistics from sports. You watch sports online or on TV these days, and tremendous amount of statistics around, possession of a ball or number of shots on goal or these kinds of things. And I can imagine a world where that kind of data could be used in conjunction with generative AI to write stories around sports based on the data in the same way earnings reports are done. But then the flip side, of course, is the sort of the real, the journalism that requires people to interpret a reality, to investigate a reality, to convey a reality in a compelling way. And it may be that AI can get to that at some point, but I think for the moment, at least from my perspective, it's better in the newsroom when it's limited to rote things that prevent people from or take away time from people.
If I can jump on something with that, because AI did it for minor league baseball, I think at almost the same time as the stock reports. But Gannett did this with sports fairly recently, and it blew up in their faces because people were reading the stories and they're like, what the hell, who wrote this? This does not sound like a person would say these sentences. I want to ask, Laura, you brought up headline writing and sort of just, here's 10 different alternatives. We all spend, those of us who write stories for a living, spend a lot of time on headlines. There's an art to it, right? And so here's an example. What is the ethical guideline right now around this? If we have 10 headlines that are auto-generated from the text, is that okay? Is that fair? Should we disclose that has been part of the process because there's an enormous amount of that the individual writer brings to the composition of a headline.
So Clara and I dream about disclosure. It's we'll have nightmares about it. And I think it takes us back to actually neatly links together these two conversations because it's about your favourite word, authenticity. And there will be newsrooms that do exactly what you've described, Santi, and do kind of minimal kind of transactional journalism. And there'll be newsrooms that want to do more than that. And I was at a conference recently and heard an advertising agency, and it was absolutely fascinating, talking about, I'm really sorry about this, but bras and panties and how you sold them to young women, right? So I'm just going to kind of, I'm going to be the person that brings bras and panties into the room. And they were saying that, they had trained a model to speak in a way that they did not recognize themselves, people in the agency, but they knew that young people liked it. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So they'd kind of got this model kind of expressing, in the vernacular that they needed to have, how to sell these things to these young women. And it kind of made me fascinated and troubled all at the same time, because what does that do to you? If you have decided that in your newsroom you're going to version your content and you are going to, do a version for audiences that might be from this demographic or from this segment, and, you're going to kind of do that, where are the journalists who then understand those audiences and can actually respond to them and write to them and kind of engage them? Because if it's all done kind of by training a model, you've lost that out of your newsroom. And I think that links right back to the fact that for me, journalism is most journalism, the non-transactional journalism, is a really personal, observational thing where I don't think audiences are going to want machines doing it yet, or if possibly ever. Because it's observational. It's like the soul of human creativity and observation. You're seeing something, you're contextualizing it, and you're giving it to other humans. And for me, that's where the conversation really needs to go as we start to onboard this technology and use it more widely. I only know of one organization that is putting stuff out to audiences without a human in the loop. And I think that's dangerous, even if it's quite low level and quite transactional. I think we need to have a conversation with ourselves about, our relationship with our audience and where we want this to sit in that relationship.
Let's talk about trust and transparency. I think this is the right time to bring up how much we need to disclose and how granular that transparency needs to be considered ethical journalism. So if we've used it to create a headline, if we've used it to version stories, of course this relies partly on consumers understanding something of the process of journalism and how it's composed, but what are emerging as the best practices around that? So, and Claire, I know you do a lot of work in this.
Yeah, so unfortunately, a lot of the precedent that's been studied is on social media platforms for conveying to audiences that content has been AI generated or not. So a lot of the research on this topic stems from that area, and I'm sure Santiago has a lot of insight into what it means to convey signals of authenticity to end users. And I'll just reflect in terms of putting this in context. Axios just put out a poll that said half of Americans think that AI-generated content will impact the upcoming elections. So if you're implementing AI in your newsroom, that's amidst an ecosystem of public literacy that AI is kind of going to be infused in all types of content. So this question of what responsibility do you have to both meet people where they are in terms of thinking that most content is AI-generated to date, but also not to induce a degree of skepticism that's going to make an already distrusting population more distrusting of the news media. And there's no perfect answer, and anyone who says they have a perfect best practice on this, I'd suggest is lying. But there are several things you can do. I'll let Santiago talk about the ways in which cryptographically signed metadata and content credentials might be a meaningful way to show when actual content has been either edited or changed if you've used AI in the actual audio-visual pipeline. But there are a few best practices related to disclosure that some research recently has thrown a wrench in. I think it's Felix Simon and Toff is the last name, recently put out an interesting paper, not to get really wonky, where they felt that they looked at different AI disclosures in newsrooms, and audiences were less trusting of those newsrooms when they read that AI was disclosed to have been used.
But they wanted the disclosures.
Correct, and I'm pretty sure that there were I'll look to my notes for this, but basically when articles disclosed a list of sources used to generate content, that almost superseded the distrust that came from the disclosure in the first place. So if there are specific elements that we used AI, but here's where our sources were, and here's kind of all this context about what we actually were using the AI for, that can kind of override it. So a few observations from our research is people want to understand what these labels mean. They don't just want a big label that says we use AI. They want to understand where it is being used and what it is being used for. There's even a question of how noticeable are they. That's a design consideration more so than it is a linguistic one, but you want to make sure people can see these things.
How noticeable the disclosures are?
What was that?
How noticeable the disclosures are?
Correct, because there are times where they can just be cropped, that if someone's taking a clip from your video or they're sharing something and the headline has a descriptor, you want to make sure that when they crop that out, the disclosure doesn't go away. And there are other instances where the question is, what is the threshold for conveying disclosure? I joke to people in a different analogy, portrait mode on your iPhone uses AI. But is that an AI edited photo to an extent that I need a label on my iPhone every time I send an iMessage to say that that's AI manipulated? Probably not, because it doesn't edit the photo in any way that's significant. If I use, I don't know, just Google to generate some ideas for headlines, we don't have that. So we're still debating this question internally about what threshold of manipulation or of AI implementation warrants disclosure. And just one notion of caution to relate to maybe some of the findings in that paper. Several years ago, and apologies to my colleagues on this stage who have heard this anecdote before, but it's very palpable. Several years ago, we did some user research about Twitter's manipulated media labels in 2021. So this is slightly different, but it is an AI disclosure, right? They were conveying to platform users that content had been manipulated using AI or not. And when we talked to different folks across the country and showed them these labels, one man told us, he said, "Oh, I thought Twitter was trying to tell me that the media was manipulating me," which, as in the institution of the media was manipulating him. So clearly people are going to bring their own confirmation bias to bear on these seemingly helpful labels for content. So we have to be very careful that over-labeling doesn't kind of prompt a degree of skepticism and concern that I think we already see and is really, really hard to get around. I'm very interested in labeling regimes or ways to do it that kind of abstract away from like the institution, and you can show exactly what you're doing and how you're using it so that people can really understand, and it's not just take my word for it, we're using AI to do things that you don't quite understand what we're doing behind the hood.
A couple of things here, though. It does seem like time is not on our side with debating these issues. That this is now the velocity of this election and the spread of disinformation and misinformation are, coming forcefully right now. And so we really don't have the luxury of spending, we have to have some ground rules for every organization. And it does seem like people are responding to that. Maybe any of you can speak to this, but that organizationally, everyone is sort of has their team or their point person who's sort of dedicated to dealing with this, but there's not, I don't know that the consortia across the industry are coming together to kind of offer, or maybe it's your organization, to offer the kind of, these are really key ground rules that we should all be operating by right now.
Yeah, I agree. So as a tech provider, these are the same conversations that we constantly have. And I love your point about, if you use your iPhone and you modify it some way, the photo, same thing. I was just thinking about our semantic recommendation engine, right? If you use that to create a story, is that something that needs to be disclosed, or is that just something that made you more efficient, right? Looking at what was already in your library, right, and using the information that's there to then make recommendations as to how to make that story better, whether it was the A roll or B roll, right? But most of the features, by the way, that I've talked about were mostly tech previews at IBC, and while it's great, right? You look at some of these things, you get very excited about what's possible. At the same time, you have to temper that enthusiasm with caution to make sure that what you are doing and putting out there doesn't contribute to some of these things that we're all concerned about. So, and I will say that's something we still grapple with, right? And it's something we talk about constantly. And there's a group within the company that just constantly examines this.
I will just add there is regulatory energy around this question. So in the AI executive order from the White House, which I'm sure all of you have read in depth, there is a huge prong that has been given to the Department of Commerce around, I think, quote, to begin exploring techniques for technology, government, civil society, and media to provide audiences with greater insight into what they see and hear. So questions about how content, I think the question of threshold, I think, has to do with in a meaningful way, in a reasonable way. A lot of that is legalese that has a lot of subjectivity to it. But everyone on this panel should tell me, I think journalistic standards are the helpful conduit to making a decision about what you disclose. What do you have as a starting place in terms of journalistic ethics about what requires a correction or what requires explanation of methods? Or we see, here's how we came to this conclusion. Here's the documents we use. There's certain precedent that we do have on our side to help us, I think, in the AI moment, make sense of what we do in terms of disclosure and
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, you can draw a distinction between different types of content. When you're talking about news and documentaries, you've absolutely got to nail it. We've always used artifice, as I kind of, used to call it elsewhere in the kind of, the broadcast chain, natural history programs. You'd never say, well, actually, this wasn't filmed in Zambia. It was filmed in a pond in Bristol. You just wouldn't say that because, unless you were making a piece about it at the end of the program. So I think we need to be careful because sometimes it feels overwhelming. And I'm massively grateful to PAI for kind of doing this thinking with us and also convening the industry around it, because I do think the more we can align around this and agree on things and on ways of doing this, because it is still quite new to us all, the better off we're going to be. And our research backs up absolutely what Claire's described, which is that it shows that people like a certain amount of information to be drilled down into. So they want to see the transparency issue is really important to them. They want to understand why we've made the decisions we've had. And they don't want to be blinded by, yes, there was a Photoshop was used here, and then there were like 15 different edits, unless they want to. And if they want that information, they should be entitled to see it, in many cases. But, they want to understand why we've made those decisions. And I think the whole kind of the new era of transparency around the decisions we make, which obviously include both synthetic media, generative AI, and other things, are going to be a massive theme for the industry in the next.
Well, it certainly seems that C2PA is emerging as a very useful tool toward the transparency and authentication of content. We've established what it is now. Two things, Santiago. First of all, can you kind of take us up to speed as to where it is right now in its rollout and adoption? And secondly, what faces the consumer that is understandable to someone who has a moderate amount of media literacy? How can they interact with a piece of content, and what do they see, and how understandable is it to them?
Well, I'll start by saying I think there's a value to looking at this landscape holistically. In other words, we've identified sort of 4 main pillars in the transparency and authenticity area. The first is what a lot of people think of automatically, which is detection. Detection software that analyzes files, looks for telltale signs of manipulation. And while that can certainly be useful on an ad hoc basis, it has a number of problems. It's not scalable, it's an arms race, and it's not particularly accurate. But it can be useful. The 3 other areas that I think are more useful are, in no particular order, policy, which was referenced, and we're seeing whether it's the executive order out of the White House or other policy that's making its way through countries and regions, which is mandated transparency about the use of AI or generative AI. And the basis for that transparency is increasingly, to your question, the C2PA standard. It's emerged as best in class because it's a group of 50 or so major tech and media companies who have offered their best and brightest people to create an incredibly robust, thorough, resilient, open standard upon which it's possible to build tools to implement this layer of transparency. That sort of logically takes you into the area of education. And education you can sort of divide into 2 main groups. Classroom education around media literacy, which is horribly lacking in most parts of the world.
It doesn't exist
in some countries it does, but they're the minority.
Yeah.
That's a longer term project, obviously, educating people. In Finland, for example, it's introduced into the classroom for kids as young as 5 and 6 because they have Russia as a neighbor and they're being bombarded with mis and disinformation. But in most other countries it barely gets a mention. But the other part of education is consumer education. And that has everything to do with, to your question, what does the consumer want? How does the consumer react? But it's not limited to the consumer. It also extends to the producer. In other words, how much information does the artist or the journalist or the photojournalist want to share with their public? And we find different groups want to share different things. Influencers are all about clicks, which leads to advertising, which leads to money. They want to share different things than journalists want to share. So that sort of customization, bespoke nature of disclosure, whether it's from the producer or conversely for the consumer. And we've done a fair amount of research, and consumers get confused quite quickly depending on the demographic as to what are they looking at, what is being conveyed. And so you're trying to find that balance to simplify it and make it effective, but for those who are interested in a deeper dive, have deeper layers available to them. So the way we're looking at that is sort of, a simple layer, a middle layer, and then a deep layer. And then the final pillar, if you like, is the notion of provenance itself. This cryptographically secure metadata that contains as much information as possible, at least from the source, and then decisions are made by publishers as to how much information they feel comfortable sharing with the viewer. Because in the world of journalism, journalists are essentially filters. In other words, we filter the information on behalf of the reader, supposedly with the best interests involved, but it's a filtering process. And so it becomes important how much to disclose. A news organization would rarely, if ever, publish a reporter's notebook verbatim, because that would be the musings of a reporter prior to publication. The whole notion of authorship and condensing information to communicate it effectively and fairly and transparently is at the heart of journalism. In other words, you distill journalism to its basic element, and it's trust, right? So conveying that to the viewer or the reader in a way that makes sense to them. But then on top of all of that, you have to layer society, and that there are going to be groups of people who are going to believe what they're going to believe and aren't going to be swayed by any level of transparency or disclosure because they have an ideological agenda or bent and they want to consume and react to news in a certain way.
Just one quick follow-up on how do these tools apply to user-generated content, or can they be? I mean, the news organizations deal with a ton of that.
They can. I mean, we're working, as I indicated at the beginning, we sort of divide our work into three main areas, right? Capture, edit, publish. On the capture side of things, integrating this technology into smartphones in particular, when we get to that point, lots of conversations underway, but when this becomes an out-of-the-box feature for smartphones, people who are interested in that notion of provenance, and not everybody will be, but those who are will be able to establish a level of provenance saying that this came from this device and this is what was done to it. And I think, that's an important thing. And when we talk to fact-checking organizations about this provenance work, they all relish the day when UGC and everything else has provenance on it because it will help them in their fact-checking. And so when we try and define sort of longer-term success in the area of provenance, it really comes down to the notion of ubiquity. In other words, a world where every piece of content that you come across, whether it's journalism or advertising or creative stuff or whatever it is, you will have the opportunity, if you so desire, to interact with it and have a deeper understanding about what it is. Because nowadays, there is almost nothing out there. We consume content, we're drenched in content, but try and find something empirical that tells you where it comes from. There's almost nothing. It's all based on trust, bias, habit, a whole series of things that don't really stand up to scrutiny.
Right. Okay, we're running out of time. There's a couple of key things I want to still ask about. One of them is a lot of news organizations are deeply concerned about how AI might use their content in unauthorized ways once they release it into the wild. So what can newsrooms currently do to protect their content once it has been published? What should they be doing right now to that end?
I think it's a decision up to each individual newsroom. So I know of a newsroom which has said, our content is publicly funded, we think it should just be out there, and if anybody wants to use it, they can use it, and they can train models on it. I suspect that with the advent of lots of licensing deals, that view might change, it might not. For the BBC, it's no secret that we have attempted to limit the use of our data, and we have instructed, several organisations not to use it. I think lots of newsrooms don't yet fully understand, and I'm not saying that we do, but the value of their data, particularly their very good contemporaneous, probably well marked up data that they're generating every day, it is valuable. And I think we're into a whole new economy where we need to think about this in lots of different ways. But I think at the moment, we're just very keen to push the stable door shut and have a good think about where we go with this in line with, I think one of the great things about this, I'm always an optimist, is that it's brought the industry closer together, and we're having so many really good conversations with other broadcasters, other publishers who are equally kind of like, what do we do about this? And then having the conversation again with the with the agencies and with the tech companies, and just saying we need to come to some sort of agreement on this. How do we do it? Particularly since regulation is always going to be likely to be slightly lagging on this, because as you say, it's moving so quickly.
Okay, and just with the couple of minutes I have left, we are awash in information about the sort of the tech companies that are producing this, OpenAI. There's a lot of volatility there. There's a lot of palace intrigue that I think is kind of characterizes the reporting around this. And so if you're a news organization, you don't really care, some of those details are maybe not interesting. The larger takeaways from that intrigue, for instance, the volatility at OpenAI, what do they need to understand about the culture of these companies, and then also kind of more broadly around that, the regulatory environment and how that is perhaps evolving to meet the moment of where we are with the technological development? Maybe let's start with the palace intrigue of the companies.
It's so fast. This space is moving at warp speed. I mean, every day there's a new development, there's a new product, there's a new incorporation of data. And I think that makes it hard for people to sort of pause and take stock of where it's headed and reflect on it. There's almost no time to think, and it keeps moving along. And the reporting on the tech world, I think, is that there's a lot of focus on that palace intrigue aspect of it because it makes for compelling reading. But trying to explain to the average person in the street about how this works and what it means potentially, I think there's a lot of opportunity there from an explanatory perspective.
Yeah, listening to the panelists today too, I feel like with all the talk about AI, it's still yet to be fully implemented or implemented in some cases at all, right? So like the talk about it is here, and the amount of people who've actually implemented it is here. So I think we're still at the beginning of the game, and so I think there's still time for us to react, despite the fact that I agree 100% with you that this is all moving incredibly fast. So.
But I think there's a lot of AI happening at the local level and is underreported often. And, if you live in a town with a bank or a school or a police bureau, chances are they are using some type of algorithm to determine where they do arrests or how many people are going to graduate. And your reporters across every beat should be asking those pertinent questions to them. Like, what are you searching for? How are you searching it? What is your algorithm? And you don't even have to be an expert on this. You can just ask simple questions. For instance, the Tampa Bay Times won a Pulitzer Prize because they started asking very simple questions to a sheriff who was doing preemptive policing at the school. And very simple questions, all of a sudden everything started to fall apart. And part of it wasn't necessarily nefarious on the sheriff's part. They were just doing whatever the AI company that delivered this software to them told them to do. But they didn't ask important questions. And it's up to reporters at the local level. So there's probably 10 pieces of gold sitting somewhere around in your communities that you can report on that I think is really important. So AI is happening at your level no matter what happens in Silicon Valley.
Okay, well, I think that's a good note to leave it on since we are over time. Thank you, panelists, for an excellent conversation.